everyone, my name is Megan and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my July reading wrap-up for you. So in July I read 16 books, which is a little less than I normally do, but still a very good reading month, in my opinion. And the first book I read was Punk 57 by Penelope Douglas. This was my first Penelope Douglas book, and I definitely enjoyed it. I think I expected a little more because I've heard such good things about Penelope Douglas. But I gave it a 3.75 out of 5, and I would definitely pick up more of her books. A friend who saw I read it recommended I read, I think it's called The Crescents next. So I saw that on Kindle Unlimited, so I'll probably pick that up next month. But if you have any other Penelope Douglas recommendations, I'm always down. The second book I read was Love Theoretically by Elle Hazelwood. I have been on an Elle Hazelwood reading train. In June, I read The Love Hypothesis and Love on the Brain, which enjoyed. I think The Love Hypothesis would be my favorite of her books so far, but they're just like fun. I like her characters. I like the concepts. I like the STEM mixed in. And I like the way that she explores being a woman in the STEM field. I think it's really interesting. The next book I read was The Demon Who Came to Dinner by Wendy Sparrow. And this is about a girl who basically brings her next door neighbor, who is a demon, home for Thanksgiving because her and her fiance break up and he has the same name as her fiance. And instead of telling her parents that her and her fiance broke up because he was sleeping with her roommate, she brings this guy instead, and he has to basically steal a soul to live another 100 years. And so his plan is to steal Katie's soul. But instead, romance ensues. It was definitely like cheesy and not necessarily the best written thing I've ever read, but totally enjoyable. I gave it a 3.5. Like, I had a good time for sure. The next book I read was Taken by the Elf King, which is the first book in the Monstrous Mates series by Charlotte Swan. And this, I think, was a little disappointing for me. I thought it would be a little different than it was, but I would be interested enough to pick up the second one. It kind of left off like on a note where you know what the second book is going to be about. I think the story was good, but the characters were a little lackluster for me. So, but it's like less than 200 pages. So if you're interested in picking it up, I mean, I don't think it was not worth it. Like, I enjoyed it. The next book I read was One Dark Window, which is the second book in the Shepherd King series by Rachel Gillig. And this was a reread for me. I had a friend who started the series, and so I wanted to reread the first one, and then I'm probably going to pick up the second one this month. She was reading it for the first time, and I couldn't quite remember all the details, except that I enjoyed it. So I figured it was worth the reread, and it definitely was. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. I love this book. I love the world. I love the magic system. I think the characters are great. And rereading it was really fun. I remembered the overarching story, but not all the little like side pieces. And I thought the twists and stuff were really good. So I'm super excited to pick up the second one this month. The next book I read was a nonfiction called Running with Sherman, the Donkey with the Heart of a Hero by Christopher McDougall. This was a recommendation from a friend's dad who we trade nonfiction recommendations all the time. And his wife was reading it and he was like, oh, this seems like your kind of book. And it really was. I love nonfiction, especially when it's about animals. This is about Sherman the donkey and kind of a family who rehabilitates him and basically is giving him a purpose. So he was in really bad conditions. They didn't know if he was going to make it, but he's really stubborn, really hardworking. And so basically it takes you through getting him back to a healthy state and then giving him the purpose of racing in these apparently very common donkey races. So that was just something I'd never heard of. It was really interesting to learn about. The main guy in it also has a lot of like Amish neighbors, and he talks about the community and how the donkeys help the community and things like that. And I thought it was really wholesome and endearing, and it was a really good story to read. The next book I read was Stuck with You by Elle Hazelwood, which is one of her STEM novellas. It's the second one. I accidentally read them out of order, but they're not dependent on each other, so you can definitely read them in whatever order you want. I enjoyed it. I really like Ali Hazelwood's writing and her characters, but I think the novella didn't necessarily lend it. I think one of her favorite tropes is like miscommunication trope. And I think in a shorter book, it didn't necessarily like translate well. I think you just kind of got thrown in and you were like, there was a mistake made and now we're going to solve it. But you didn't get to see like the progress of that as much, which is just, you know, the nature of a novella. But I thought it was good. Like, I like her writing. I like her characters, but it wasn't like you must read this. But what was a must read was my next book, which was Snowglobe by Soyoung Park. I got this recommendation from Carrie Can Read, and I remember hearing her talk about it, and she was like, it's very Hunger Games meets The Truman Show. And I was just like, that is such a bizarre mix that I never thought that anyone would write. But she was right, and it was so good. The ending, I remember, was a little lackluster for me, but I'm like super into the world. I gave it a 4.25. I would highly recommend, especially if you were a big reader during like the dystopian kind of time of like the late 2000s, early 2010s. I think that this really scratches that itch, and I highly enjoyed it. The next book I read was Food for Thought by Ariana Ferrante, and this is a story about Limos, who is the goddess of starvation, I believe, and Demeter, who is the harvest goddess. And it's really short story, so I don't want to give too much away, but I thought it was really interesting story. I can't necessarily tell you what it's about without spoiling, because it is so short. But basically, like, they are goddesses of opposite things, and the fates are trying to keep them apart. But eventually, they do come together for a purpose, and it's kind of like the repercussions and the story of what happens. And I thought it was great. The next 3 books I read were the first 3 books in the Off-Campus series by Elle Kennedy. And so I read The Deal, The Mistake, and The Score. The Deal was definitely my favorite out of all of those, but I highly enjoyed them all. All of the Off-Campus books that I've read so far follow students at Briar U, and they tend to have main guy be some kind of athlete, where you think that he's just going to be like the dumb jock or whatever, and there's always more to him, which, you know, cheesy, yes. Do I love it? Yes. And I also think she did a really good job at having well-rounded characters and like interesting characters and good stories and stuff. So I would definitely recommend the series. The first one was by far my favorite. The next book I read was Dungeons and Drama by Kristy Boyce. This was like a YA, just super cute. It's like a girl who gets in trouble, and she's got to go work at her dad's game store as like her punishment. And she meets one of the employees there, and he's like super judgmental of her being like a theater kid and like not being into games. And she's judgmental of him for like not caring and all that. And basically it's like their budding friendship and just kind of how they get to know each other, and basically realizing that preconceived notions are silly, and it's very cute. The next book I read was When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamín Labatut. I don't know how to say that. This was fiction mixed with like real people like Albert Einstein, and it follows a few different scientists and mathematicians and physicists and things like that. And it kind of deals with the stories of like when you are creating things, how do you kind of decide like what is right and wrong? Like your goal is to progress your field, but you don't really get to decide what that progress does and like how it affects the world. I think some of the science went a little over my head when we got into like quantum physics and things like that. But for the most part, I think that I understood everything. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really interesting, and it talked about some really interesting concepts. So I think if that's something that sounds like you would enjoy it, I would definitely give it a read. The second to last book I read in July was The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. And this I really enjoyed as well. I've read her book, The Vampires of El Norte, before, and I loved that, so I knew I would probably love this. I think she's got such an interesting, like, gothic style, and she does it really well. This, I thought, was really enjoyable. I liked the main character. I liked the plot. I liked the elements of, like, historical fiction and, like, the mystery and like the horror elements to it. I just think it's a super atmospheric book, and I really, really enjoyed it. And then the last book I read was The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, and this is nonfiction. It's kind of following her life with her and then her partner, and it follows them through like her partner previously had a relationship and has a child, and then also the author gets pregnant and like dealing with that as well, and kind of it talks about like gender and identity and love and just sexuality, and it just had so many interesting concepts, and I really enjoyed the way that she wrote. I thought she handled everything really well, and like it was just really interesting to read about, and like, you know, who gets to decide what is the right way to love someone, or like the correct structure to have in a relationship and things like that. And I just thought it was really well written and a really interesting memoir. So anyway, those are the 16 books that I read in July, and if you liked this video, consider giving it a like, maybe subscribe, and I'll see you in another video soon. Bye.